My name is David, and this is the story of how our HOA President Karen Thompson learned that some battles aren't worth picking, especially when you're fighting against the wrong enemy. It started 3 months ago when I moved back to Willowbrook Estates to take care of my 82-year-old father, a Korean War veteran who'd been living alone since Mom passed. Dad had always been proud of his service, and every morning without fail, he'd raise his American flag on the modest flagpole he'd installed in our front yard 20 years ago. The flag meant everything to him. It represented not just his country, but the brothers he'd served with, some of whom never made it home. Karen Thompson had been the HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd managed to turn our quiet neighborhood into her personal kingdom. She was the type of person who measured grass height with a ruler and sent violation letters if your mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Karen drove a white SUV with vanity plates that read, quote, HOA Queen, unquote, which should tell you everything you need to know about her personality. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in March. I was having coffee with Dad on the front porch when Karen's SUV pulled into our driveway. She emerged wearing her usual uniform, a crisp white blouse, navy blazer, and an expression that suggested she'd been personally offended by our very existence. Karen speaking in a shrill, authoritative tone. Mr. Johnson, I need to discuss a serious violation of our community standards. That flagpole exceeds the height restrictions outlined in Section 12-A of our covenant, and the flag itself is not in compliance with our aesthetic guidelines. I nearly choked on my coffee. Dad just sat there, his weathered hands gripping his mug a little tighter, speaking calmly. I'm sorry, Karen, but could you clarify what aesthetic guidelines you're referring to? My father's been flying that flag for 2 decades without any issues. Karen pulled out a thick binder from her oversized purse, flipping through it with theatrical precision. Karen speaking. The covenant clearly states that all external decorations must maintain the community's upscale appearance. Flags are limited to holiday displays, maximum 72 hours, and must not exceed 18 inches in any dimension. Dad finally spoke up, his voice steady but with an edge I recognized from my childhood. Dad speaking in a gravelly voice. Young lady, that flag has flown over this house since before you moved to this neighborhood. It's not coming down. Karen's face flushed red. She wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as beneath her authority. Karen speaking, voice rising. Mr. Johnson, I don't think you understand. As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce these covenants. You have 72 hours to remove that flagpole, or you'll face daily fines of $50 until compliance is achieved. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice level, speaking with controlled calm. Karen, I think there might be some confusion here. Could you show me exactly where in the covenant it mentions restrictions on American flags displayed by veterans? She fumbled through her binder, clearly not expecting the question. Karen speaking, flustered. The restrictions apply to all external decorations. There are no special exceptions. Speaking with a slight smile, that's interesting, because I spent some time yesterday reviewing both the HOA covenants and federal law. Are you familiar with the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act? Karen's confident expression wavered. She obviously had no idea what I was talking about, but her pride wouldn't let her admit it. Karen speaking defensively. Our covenants supersede any federal suggestions. This is private property managed by a homeowners association. I couldn't help but chuckle. Speaking, federal suggestions? Karen, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act is federal law. It specifically prohibits homeowner associations from restricting the display of the American flag by property owners. You can't enforce a covenant that violates federal law. Dad was grinning now, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. Karen, meanwhile, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Karen speaking, voice getting higher. I don't care what some federal law says. This is my neighborhood, and these are my rules. The flag comes down, or you'll be hearing from our attorney. Speaking calmly, your attorney? You mean the association's attorney? Because I think they might want to know that you're threatening to pursue legal action that would violate federal law. That could expose the HOA to some serious liability. Karen slammed her binder shut. Karen speaking angrily. You think you're so smart, don't you? We'll see about that. I'll have the entire board review this matter, and when we vote to uphold the violation, you'll have no choice but to comply. After she stormed off, Dad looked at me with pride. Dad speaking, "Son, I think you just rattled her cage pretty good. But you know she's not going to give up easy." He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen launched what could only be described as a campaign of harassment. She sent daily violation letters, not just about the flag, but about everything she could possibly find wrong with our property. Our grass was allegedly too long, then too short. Our mailbox was the wrong shade of black, even though it was identical to every other mailbox in the neighborhood. She claimed our trash cans were visible from the street, despite being in the exact same location they'd been for 20 years. The breaking point came when Karen organized what she called an emergency board meeting to address what she termed the Johnson flag crisis. She sent notice to every homeowner in the neighborhood, painting Dad and me as troublemakers who were threatening the very fabric of our community. The meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. Karen had arranged the room like a courtroom, with herself at a table facing rows of chairs for residents. She'd even brought a gavel, which she used liberally throughout the evening to maintain what she called proper order. About 30 neighbors showed up, which was actually a pretty good turnout for our usual HOA meetings. Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Karen speaking in an official tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community standards. The Johnson family has refused to comply with covenant regulations regarding external decorations." She went on for 10 minutes, making it sound like Dad's flag was somehow going to destroy property values and turn our neighborhood into a slum. She used phrases like, quote, "precedent-setting defiance," unquote, and, quote, "erosion of community standards," unquote. You'd think we were flying a pirate flag instead of the stars and stripes. When she finally gave me a chance to speak, I stood up and addressed the room calmly. Speaking to the crowd, "Neighbors, I think there's been some confusion about the situation. My father is a Korean War veteran who's been proudly displaying the American flag in compliance with federal law. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act specifically protects his right to do so." Karen banged her gavel. Karen shouting, "The federal government has no jurisdiction over our private community covenants." That's when our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a retired school teacher, raised her hand. Mrs. Patterson speaking, "Karen, dear, I think you might want to research this a bit more. My late husband was an attorney, and I remember him mentioning that federal law does indeed supersede HOA covenants in certain circumstances." Karen's face was getting redder by the minute. Karen speaking loudly, "I don't care what anyone's dead husband supposedly said. We have rules in this community, and everyone needs to follow them. No exceptions." The room went dead silent. You could practically hear everyone's intake of breath. Mrs. Patterson looked like she'd been slapped, and several other neighbors started murmuring among themselves. Karen had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Speaking firmly but calmly, "Karen, I think you owe Mrs. Patterson an apology. And I think this board needs to understand that you're asking them to vote in favor of violating federal law." Karen stood up, her voice reaching a pitch that could probably shatter glass. Karen screaming, "I am the president of this HOA. What I say goes. If you don't like it, you can move somewhere else." That's when I played my ace card. Speaking clearly. "Actually, Karen, what you say doesn't go when it violates the law. And since you seem determined to pursue this illegal course of action, I've already filed a complaint with the city's Code Enforcement Division." Karen's eyes went wide. Karen sputtering, You what?" Speaking calmly, "I filed a formal complaint alleging HOA overreach and potential violation of federal law. The City Council has scheduled a public hearing for next Tuesday evening to review the matter. I believe they're also planning to bring cameras to document the proceedings for the public record." The color drained from Karen's face. She knew exactly what this meant. Our City Council meetings were broadcast on local cable television, and recordings were posted online. Her little power trip was about to become very public, and not in a way that would make her look good. Karen speaking, voice cracking, "You can't do that. This is a private matter between neighbors." Speaking with a slight smile, "Actually, Karen, when an HOA attempts to violate federal law, it becomes a matter of public interest. The city has a responsibility to ensure that homeowner associations operating within their jurisdiction aren't overstepping their legal authority." Karen looked around the room desperately, hoping for support from the other board members. but they were all staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to embarrassment. Board member Tom Martinez finally spoke up, Tom speaking nervously. Karen, maybe we should table this discussion and consult with our attorney first. Karen screaming, we don't need an attorney. I know what I'm doing. That's when Mrs. Patterson stood up and walked toward the door. Mrs. Patterson speaking coldly. I think I've heard quite enough for one evening. Karen, you should be ashamed of yourself. Several other neighbors followed her out. Over the weekend, word spread quickly through the neighborhood about Karen's meltdown and the upcoming city council hearing. I started getting calls and text messages from neighbors expressing their support for Dad and their embarrassment about Karen's behavior. It turned out that most people in the neighborhood actually supported Dad's right to fly his flag and were tired of Karen's increasingly authoritarian approach to HOA management. Tuesday evening arrived, and the city council chambers were packed. Karen showed up wearing what appeared to be her most professional outfit, clearly hoping to make a good impression on the council and the cameras. She'd also brought her attorney, a nervous-looking man who kept checking his phone and seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m., and by 6:45, every seat in the chamber was filled. Local news had picked up the story, and there were at least 3 different camera crews present. The headline on the evening news had been, quote, HOA President battles veteran over American flag, unquote, which wasn't exactly the kind of publicity Karen had been hoping for. City Council Chairman Robert Hayes called the hearing to order and explained the purpose of the meeting. Chairman Hayes speaking formally. We're here tonight to review a complaint alleging that Willowbrook Estates HOA is attempting to enforce covenant restrictions that may violate federal law, specifically the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act. Karen's attorney requested to speak first, and Chairman Hayes granted permission. Attorney speaking nervously, members of the council, my client Mrs. Thompson and the Willowbrook Estates HOA maintain that their covenants are legally enforceable, and that property owners within the association are bound by the terms they agreed to when purchasing their homes. It was a weak opening, and everyone in the room could see it. The attorney was essentially arguing that HOA covenants could override federal law, which was a losing position from the start. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium with a folder full of documentation, speaking clearly to the council. Chairman Hayes, council members, thank you for taking the time to review this matter. The facts are straightforward. My father, a Korean War veteran, has been displaying the American flag on his property for 20 years without incident. Mrs. Thompson has recently demanded its removal, claiming it violates HOA covenants. I handed copies of my research to each council member. Continuing, as you can see from the documentation I've provided, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act specifically prohibits homeowner associations from restricting the display of the American flag by property owners. This federal law supersedes any conflicting covenant restrictions. Karen couldn't contain herself any longer. She stood up and interrupted, despite not being recognized by the chair. Karen shouting, "This is ridiculous. We have standards in our community. We can't just let people do whatever they want." Chairman Hayes gavelled for order. Chairman Hayes speaking sternly, Mrs. Thompson, you'll have your opportunity to speak when recognized. Please remain seated. But Karen was beyond listening to authority that wasn't her own. Karen continuing to shout, these people moved into our neighborhood. They agreed to our rules. The flag is too big, the pole is too tall, and it doesn't match our aesthetic standards. The room erupted in murmurs, and several people could be heard expressing their disapproval of Karen's outburst. One of the news cameras had zoomed in on her red, angry face, capturing every word for the evening broadcast. Chairman Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly. Chairman Hayes speaking firmly. Mrs. Thompson, if you cannot control yourself, you will be removed from these proceedings. This is your final warning. Karen's attorney was frantically tugging on her sleeve, trying to get her to sit down and be quiet, but she shook him off. Karen speaking loudly. I've been managing that community for 3 years. I've increased property values. I've maintained standards. And now you're going to let some troublemaker destroy everything I've worked for because of some supposed federal law that nobody's ever heard of. That did it. Chairman Hayes signaled to the bailiff. Chairman Hayes speaking with authority. Mrs. Thompson, you are disrupted these proceedings and showing disrespect for this council and these citizens. You are hereby ordered to leave the chamber immediately." Karen looked stunned. She clearly hadn't expected to be kicked out of her own hearing. Karen sputtering, "You can't throw me out. This is about my HOA. I have rights." The bailiff approached Karen, and her attorney finally managed to convince her to leave voluntarily rather than be escorted out. As they walked toward the exit, Karen turned back to shout one final declaration. Karen yelling, "This isn't over. I'll appeal this. I'll sue the city. I'll sue all of you." The doors closed behind them, and Chairman Hayes called for order once again. With Karen out of the room, the remainder of the hearing proceeded smoothly. Council member Sarah Williams asked several thoughtful questions about the federal law and its application to HOA covenants. Council member Williams speaking, "Mr. Johnson, in your research, have you found any cases where federal law has been successfully challenged by homeowner association covenants?" Speaking confidently, "No." Council member Williams, "Federal law is clear on this matter. The Freedom to Display the American Flag Act was specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of situation. Veterans and all Americans have the right to display the flag on their property, regardless of HOA restrictions." The council deliberated for about 15 minutes before Chairman Hayes announced their decision. Chairman Hayes speaking officially, "After reviewing the evidence presented tonight, this council finds that Willowbrook Estates HOA lacks the legal authority to restrict the display of the American flag as described in the complaint. We hereby order the HOA to cease all enforcement actions related to Mr. Johnson's flag display and to remove any fines or penalties that have been assessed." The chamber erupted in applause. Dad, who had been sitting quietly in the front row throughout the hearing, stood up and saluted the council. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. But the evening wasn't over yet. As people were filing out of the chamber, I overheard two women discussing something that made my blood run cold. First woman speaking, "Did you see Karen's behavior tonight? That was absolutely disgraceful." Second woman responding, "Someone needs to call for a special HOA meeting to remove her from the board. She's completely out of control." It turned out that several residents had already been planning to call for Karen's removal even before the city council hearing. Her performance tonight had simply been the final straw. Within 24 hours, a petition was circulating throughout Willowbrook Estates calling for a special meeting to vote on removing Karen Thompson from her position as HOA president. The petition gained signatures quickly. By Friday afternoon, they had the required 25% of homeowners needed to call for a special meeting. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, exactly 1 week after the city council hearing that had started Karen's downfall. Karen spent the weekend going door to door, desperately trying to drum up support and convince people that she was the victim in this situation. But her strategy backfired spectacularly. Several neighbors later told me that her visits had actually convinced them to sign the petition, because she seemed completely unhinged and unable to accept responsibility for her actions. The special HOA meeting drew an even bigger crowd than the city council hearing. Word had spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond about Karen's public meltdown, and people were curious to see how the story would end. The community center was packed wall to wall with residents. Since Karen was the subject of the vote, board member Tom Martinez served as temporary chairman for the meeting. He called the meeting to order and explained the purpose of the gathering. Tom speaking nervously, "We're here tonight to vote on a petition to remove Karen Thompson from her position as HOA president, based on allegations of misconduct and exceeding her authority." Karen had prepared a speech defending her actions, and Tom reluctantly gave her the floor. She approached the podium with a thick stack of papers, clearly intending to make a lengthy presentation. Karen speaking in a strained voice, "Neighbors, I've served this community faithfully for 3 years. I've worked tirelessly to maintain our property values and community standards." For the next 20 minutes, Karen delivered what could only be described as a rambling, self-serving monologue. She portrayed herself as a misunderstood public servant who was being persecuted for doing her job. She claimed that the Johnson flag controversy was just the tip of the iceberg, and that if residents didn't support her, the neighborhood would descend into chaos. Karen continuing, "If you remove me tonight, you're sending a message that anyone can ignore our covenants whenever they feel like it. Today it's a flag. Tomorrow it could be pink flamingos or garden gnomes or any other eyesore that destroys our property values. Several people in the audience could be heard laughing at the pink flamingo comment, which only seemed to make Karen more agitated. She raised her voice and started gesturing wildly. Karen speaking more frantically. You think this is funny? You think I'm some kind of joke? I've dedicated my life to this community. I've sacrificed my time, my energy, my reputation. That's when Mrs. Patterson, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, raised her hand. Tom recognized her, and she stood up to speak. Mrs. Patterson speaking calmly. Karen, dear, I think you've sacrificed something else too. You've sacrificed the respect and trust of your neighbors. The room erupted in applause, and Karen's face turned bright red. She clearly wasn't expecting to be challenged so directly. Karen shouting, You don't know what you're talking about. None of you understand the pressures of leadership. None of you appreciate what I've done for this neighborhood. Tom banged his gavel, trying to restore order, but Karen kept talking. Karen continuing to shout, And you, Johnson. She pointed directly at me. You started all of this. You and your father and your precious flag. You've turned everyone against me. I stood up calmly and addressed the room, speaking steadily. Actually, Karen, I think you did that all by yourself. The vote was held immediately after Karen finished her speech. Tom called for all residents in favor of removing Karen Thompson from her position as HOA president to raise their hands. The response was overwhelming. Out of approximately 80 residents present, 73 voted in favor of removal. Only Karen herself and 2 of her close friends voted against it. Tom announced the results with obvious relief. Tom speaking officially. By a vote of 73-3, the motion to remove Karen Thompson from her position as HOA president is approved, effective immediately. Karen sat in stunned silence for several seconds, apparently unable to process what had just happened. Then she exploded. Karen screaming, This is illegal. You can't do this to me. I'll sue all of you. I'll have my attorney challenge this vote. This is a conspiracy. She grabbed her papers and stormed toward the exit, but stopped at the door to deliver one final tirade. Karen yelling, You'll regret this. All of you. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without me. Your property values will plummet. You'll be begging me to come back. The door slammed behind her with such force that it rattled the windows. The room sat in stunned silence for a moment before someone started clapping, and soon the entire room was applauding. Tom gavelled for order and announced that nominations for a new HOA president would be accepted at the next regular meeting. But Karen's humiliation wasn't quite complete yet. The next morning, I was having coffee with Dad on the front porch when we saw a familiar white SUV pull into Karen's driveway across the street. Karen got out of the passenger seat, followed by a woman in a business suit carrying a briefcase. They had what appeared to be a heated discussion on Karen's front lawn before the woman handed Karen some papers and walked back to her car. Dad and I watched the interaction with interest. Dad speaking, What do you suppose that was about? Speaking thoughtfully, I'm not sure, but given the way Karen's been threatening to sue everyone, my guess is that was her attorney delivering some bad news about her legal options. I was right. Later that afternoon, Tom Martinez called me with an update. Tom speaking on the phone. David, I thought you'd want to know. Karen's attorney contacted our HOA attorney this morning. Apparently, Karen instructed him to file lawsuits against you, your father, the city council, and about half the neighborhood. Speaking with amusement. And I'm guessing he declined? Tom laughing. More than declined. He withdrew as counsel and sent Karen a bill for services rendered. Turns out he'd been researching the flag issue and realized that not only does she have no case, but pursuing frivolous lawsuits could expose her to sanctions and legal fees. That evening, there was a knock on our door. I opened it to find Karen standing on our porch, looking more deflated than I'd ever seen her. Gone was the aggressive posture and commanding tone. She looked tired, defeated, and for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely vulnerable. Karen speaking quietly, I wanted to apologize. To your father. And to you. I was so surprised I almost couldn't respond. Speaking carefully, That's unexpected, Karen. Would you like to come in? She shook her head. Karen continuing, No, I wanted you to know that I talked to my attorney today. He explained about the federal law and how wrong I was. Dad had heard voices and came to the door. Karen looked up at him with what appeared to be genuine remorse. Karen speaking to Dad, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry I tried to make you take down your flag. I didn't understand what it meant to you, and I was wrong to try. Dad studied her for a moment before responding. Dad speaking gravelly. Takes courage to admit when you're wrong, young lady. Apology accepted. Karen nodded and turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back. Karen speaking sadly. I got a call from my boss today. Someone at my office saw the news coverage of the city council meeting. I'm being transferred to a different department, away from any client-facing roles. She walked back to her car and drove away. Dad and I stood on the porch for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. Dad speaking. You know, son, I almost feel sorry for her. Speaking thoughtfully. Almost. The next week was blissfully quiet. No violation letters arrived in our mailbox. No white SUV patrolled the neighborhood looking for covenant infractions. The American flag continued to fly proudly in our front yard, just as it had for 20 years before Karen Thompson decided it was a problem. On Friday afternoon, I was working in the garage when Tom Martinez stopped by with news that would put the final punctuation mark on the Karen Thompson saga. Tom speaking with barely contained excitement. David, you're not going to believe this. I just got off the phone with our HOA attorney. Speaking curiously, what's going on now? Tom continuing. Remember how Karen kept threatening to sue everyone? Well, our attorney did some research into HOA board member liability, and it turns out that Karen's actions may have exposed her to personal financial responsibility for any legal costs the association incurred. I felt a chill run down my spine. Speaking slowly. What kind of legal costs? Tom speaking seriously. All the attorney consultations, the research into federal flag laws, the preparation for potential litigation that she demanded. Plus, there's the cost of the special meeting, printing and mailing violation notices that were legally invalid, and administrative costs related to her unauthorized enforcement actions. Speaking with growing realization, how much are we talking about? Tom pulled out a piece of paper and consulted his notes. Tom reading. According to our attorney, Karen's personal liability for HOA legal expenses related to the flag controversy and her subsequent actions totals $12,437. I almost choked. Speaking in disbelief. $12,000? Tom nodding. The attorney is required by HOA bylaws to send her an invoice for the full amount, since her actions were undertaken without board authorization and in violation of federal law. She has 30 days to pay, or the HOA can place a lien on her property. The irony was perfect. Karen Thompson, who had spent 3 years wielding HOA rules like a weapon against her neighbors, was about to be crushed by those very same rules. Her unauthorized enforcement actions and threats of litigation had generated thousands of dollars in legal expenses that she was personally responsible for paying. 2 days later, Dad and I were sitting on the front porch when we saw a process server walk up to Karen's front door. Through our window, we could see Karen's face go white as she signed for the envelope. She opened it right there on her doorstep, and we watched her legs give out as she sank down onto her porch steps. $12,437. The final bill for Karen Thompson's reign of terror had arrived, and she was the one who had to pay it.